He was just fixing a cabin in the middle of a blizzard, a kid out of his depth. She walked in, older, guarded, her eyes hiding a story that wasn't his to know. What she whispered next would burn in his chest forever. The wind tore through the pines, a relentless howl that made the cabin on Juniper Ridge feel like it was holding its breath. I'm Elias Torrance, 22, still figuring out how to stand steady in a world that felt too vast, too unforgiving. I'd come to this remote corner of northern Maine to help my cousin Marcus patch up his late father's hunting lodge, a crumbling relic of weathered logs and sagging beams perched on a ridge 10 miles from the nearest gas station on Route 17. It was supposed to be a quick gig: hammer some nails, replace a few rotten boards, and clear out the dust of decades before winter buried the place. But the blizzard hit early, a monstrous wall of snow and ice that turned the dirt road into a white abyss. Marcus had driven to town for supplies before the storm locked us in, leaving me alone with a toolbox I barely knew how to use and a fire that was more stubborn than I was. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old memories, a mix of pine and mildew that clung to everything. I was crouched by the fireplace, coaxing a half-charred log to catch, my fingers smudged with ash. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows when a knock came. 3 sharp raps, faint but deliberate, cutting through the storm's roar. My heart jumped. Nobody should be out here, not in this weather, not in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed the iron poker, its weight cold and solid in my hand, and crossed the creaking floorboards to the door. My boots scuffed against the uneven wood, and I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, insistent. I opened the door, and the cold rushed in, biting through my flannel shirt. There she stood, a figure half swallowed by the storm. Her name, I'd learn later, was Nora Hadley. Snow dusted her gray wool coat, her dark hair plastered to her face, strands clinging to her cheeks like ink spilled on pale canvas. She was older than me, probably late 30s, maybe 40, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held a quiet weight, like she'd seen too much to bother with pretense. Her lips were pale, trembling from the cold, but her gaze was steady, pinning me where I stood. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the wind. "My car's stuck a mile down the ridge. I saw your light." I didn't know what to say. The storm was a beast, and she was out here alone, no jacket thick enough to fight that kind of cold. "Come in," I said, stepping aside, my voice rougher than I meant. She hesitated, her eyes flicking past me into the dim cabin, then crossed the threshold, bringing a gust of snow with her. The door slammed shut, and the room felt smaller, the air heavier, like her presence had shifted something I couldn't name. She stood just inside, dripping snow onto the floor, her hands stuffed deep in her coat pockets, her shoulders hunched against the chill. "I'm Elias," I said, setting the poker down but keeping it within reach. "This is my cousin's place. I'm just fixing it up." I gestured at the toolbox, feeling like an idiot for explaining myself. The cabin was bare, a sagging couch, a wooden table scarred with knife marks, a few mismatched chairs Marcus had scavenged from a thrift store in Bangor. The fire was finally catching, casting flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that spoke of years lived hard. "Nora," she said, offering no last name, no explanation. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like she was holding something back. "You're soaked," I said, stating the obvious, my hands fidgeting. "There's a blanket on the couch. I'll get the fire going stronger." She didn't move at first, her eyes scanning the room like she was weighing whether to trust me or run back into the storm. Finally, she nodded and crossed to the couch, peeling off her coat. Underneath, she wore a dark sweater and jeans, both clinging to her from the wet, outlining a frame that was slender but strong, like she'd carried more than her share of burdens. I busied myself with the fire, tossing on another log, trying not to notice the way her movements were deliberate, each step measured, like she was walking a tightrope. The storm raged on, the wind slamming against the walls, making the windows shudder. "Your car," I said, breaking the silence, my voice louder than I meant. "What happened?" She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, her fingers gripping the edges tightly like it was an anchor. "Slid off the road into a ditch," she said, her tone flat but tinged with something, frustration, maybe, or resignation. "I was heading to Millinocket. Didn't think the storm would hit this hard." I nodded, watching the fire, wondering what she wasn't saying. Why was she driving alone on a back road in weather like this? What was she running from? I didn't ask. Instead, I grabbed a kettle from the counter, filling it from a jug of water Marcus had left. "Tea?" I offered, feeling clumsy, like a kid playing at being a host. She looked at me, and for the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. Small, almost sad, but enough to make my chest tighten. "Sure," she said. "Thanks." I rummaged through Marcus's supplies, finding a tin of chamomile tea and 2 chipped mugs, the kind you'd find in a diner that hadn't been updated since the 80s. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, broken only by the fire's crackle and the storm's endless howl. As the kettle heated, I stole glances at her. She was staring into the flames, her expression unreadable, but there was a tension in her jaw, a tightness that spoke of something buried deep. Her hands were wrapped around her knees now, the blanket slipping slightly, and I noticed a faint scar above her eyebrow, jagged and pale like a story she hadn't told. I wondered what had left it, what kind of life she'd led, but I kept my questions locked down. The kettle whistled, and I poured the tea, crossing to hand her a mug. Our fingers brushed, and I felt a jolt, like a spark, though I told myself it was nothing. She didn't seem to notice, just took the mug and stared into it, her hands cradling the warmth. "You don't have to stay up," she said after a moment, her voice soft but steady. "I'll be fine here until the storm passes." But there was a waver in it, a crack in her composure, and I caught it, like a flicker of light in the dark. "I'm not going anywhere," I said too quickly, my face heating up. "I mean, it's not safe out there. You can't walk back in this." She looked at me then, really looked, and I felt exposed, like she could see the nerves I was trying to hide. "You're kind," she said, but it wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, like she was surprised to find kindness in a place like this. We sat sipping tea, the fire warming the room but not the space between us. It was heavy, charged, like the air before lightning strikes. I told her about the cabin, about Marcus's half-baked plan to turn it into a rental for hunters, about how I was only here because I needed the money after dropping out of college. My words felt small, like I was filling space, but she listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes never leaving me. She didn't offer much about herself, just that she lived in Portland, had business up north, was passing through. I didn't push. Something about her made questions feel like trespassing. The wind rattled the windows again, a draft slipping through, making the flames dance. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter, and I noticed the way her fingers trembled. Just slightly. "This place is old," she said, almost to herself, her voice soft but carrying a weight I couldn't place. "Feels like it's holding on to something." I tried to laugh, to lighten the mood. "Yeah, Marcus says his dad used to hear voices out here. Probably just the wind." But she didn't smile, just looked at me, her eyes dark and searching, like she was trying to decide if I was someone she could trust. Hours passed, the storm blotting out time, the fire burning low. I got up to add more wood, and as I did I felt her watching me, not obviously, but enough to make my skin prickle. I turned, catching her gaze, and for a moment neither of us looked away. Her eyes were deep, like they held a story she wasn't ready to tell, and I felt something shift inside me, something I didn't want to name. I broke the moment, turning back to the fire, my heart pounding harder than it should have. She stood, stretching, and crossed to the window, peering out into the white chaos. It's not letting up, she said, her voice low, her finger tracing a slow, aimless line through the condensation on the glass. The gesture was small, but it felt intimate, like she was letting me see something private. I joined her, standing closer than I meant to, close enough to catch the faint scent of her damp sweater, wool and lavender, soft but sharp. "You ever feel like you're running from something?" she said, not looking at me, her voice barely above a whisper, "even when you don't know what it is?" My throat went dry. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. "All the time." She turned her head, just slightly, and our eyes met again, the pull between us stronger now, like a tide I didn't know how to fight. I wanted to ask what she was running from, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I said, "You can stay here as long as you need." Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but she just nodded, her expression unreadable, and turned back to the window. The cabin felt like the only place left in the world, the storm sealing us in, the fire's glow wrapping us in a fragile warmth. I didn't know what was happening, didn't want to think about it too hard, but something was starting, something I wasn't sure I could stop. This was only the beginning. She hadn't shown her hand yet, but I could feel it. Something was about to break open. The storm hadn't let up, its howl a living thing that pressed against the cabin's walls, making the old logs groan like they were pleading for mercy. I'm Elias Torrance, 22, stuck in this crumbling hunting lodge on Juniper Ridge, northern Maine, with a woman who'd walked out of the blizzard and into my life like a shadow I couldn't shake. Nora Hadley sat across from me, her knees drawn up under a frayed blanket, her dark hair still damp, catching the firelight in soft, unruly waves. She was older than me, late 30s or pushing 40, her face carrying the kind of beauty that didn't shout but whispered, sharp cheekbones, pale skin flushed from the cold, and eyes that held a story she wasn't telling. The air between us was thick, not with words, but with something heavier, something that made my pulse race every time her gaze lingered too long. I leaned against the scarred wooden table, my hands restless, picking at a splinter in the grain. The fire was steady now, its warmth pushing back the chill, but it did nothing for the tension coiling inside me. She'd asked if I ever felt stuck, and my answer, about running in place, had left a silence that felt like it could swallow us whole. Her eyes were on the flames, but her fingers twisted the blanket's edge, a small, nervous tick that betrayed the calm she wore like armor. I wanted to ask her what she meant, what kept her tethered to something she couldn't outrun, but my tongue felt heavy, my thoughts tangled in the way she sat there, so close yet so untouchable. "You're quiet," she said, her voice cutting through the storm's roar, soft but deliberate, like she was testing the water. A faint smile played at the corner of her mouth, not teasing but curious, like she was trying to peel back the layers of my silence. I shifted, my boots scuffing the floor, and felt my face heat up. "Yeah, well," I said, my voice rougher than I meant, "I'm not great with words. Never know what'll come out wrong." It was honest, maybe too honest, and I braced for her to brush it off, to retreat back into that guarded quiet of hers. Instead, she leaned forward, just slightly, her elbows resting on her knees, her eyes locking onto mine. "I don't think you'd say anything wrong," she said, and there was a weight to it, like she meant more than she was letting on. My chest tightened, and I looked away, focusing on the fire, the way the logs cracked and sparked, anything to avoid the pull of her gaze. She was older, probably married, probably just being kind to a kid stuck in a cabin with her. But her words landed like stones in still water, rippling through me, stirring things I didn't want to name. The wind slammed against the windows, rattling the glass in its frames, and I stood, needing to move, to do something with my hands. I crossed to the kitchenette, a cramped corner with a rusty sink and a propane stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Nixon era. "I'll make us something to eat," I said, rummaging through Marcus's supplies, a cardboard box stuffed with canned goods, and a bag of stale crackers. "Chili okay? It's about all we've got." My voice sounded too loud, too eager, like I was trying to fill the space between us with something normal. She didn't answer right away, just watched me, her eyes following my movements like she was memorizing them. "You don't have to," she said finally, but there was no force behind it, like she was too tired to argue. I ignored her, pulling out a can of chili and a dented pot, grateful for the distraction. The stove sputtered to life, a weak blue flame flickering under the pot, and I stirred the chili, the smell of spices cutting through the cabin's musty air. I kept stealing glances at her, the way she sat with one leg tucked under her, the blanket slipping off her shoulder, revealing the curve of her collarbone under her damp sweater. There was a scar above her eyebrow, faint but jagged, and I wondered again what had left it, what kind of life had carved that mark into her. "You come out here a lot?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me, cracking slightly. She tilted her head, her fingers pausing on the blanket. "Not in years," she said, her voice soft, almost wistful. "My father used to bring me to a place like this when I was a kid. A cabin off Route 17, smaller, half falling apart. He'd fish in the river, and I'd wander the woods, pretending I was someone else." She paused, her eyes distant, like she was standing in those woods again. "It's strange being back. Feels like I'm stepping into a memory I don't belong in anymore." Her words hit me harder than they should have, like they were pulling at something inside me, something lonely and raw. I wanted to ask more, where she'd been, what had changed, why she sounded so hollow, but I didn't. Instead, I kept stirring the chili, the spoon scraping the pot, a steady rhythm against the storm's chaos. "Sounds like you miss it," I said, glancing over my shoulder. She gave a small laugh, sharp and brief, like I'd caught her off guard. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I just miss who I was back then." The chili was ready, steaming in the pot, and I ladled it into 2 bowls, the kind with faded floral patterns you'd find in a grandmother's kitchen. I handed her one, our fingers brushing again, and that jolt was back, sharper this time, like a current running through my skin. She took the bowl, her eyes flicking to mine, and I thought I saw something there, a flicker, a question, but she looked away, cradling the bowl like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. We ate in silence, the fire crackling softly, the storm sealing us in. The chili was too salty, but neither of us complained, and I kept watching her, the way her hands moved, precise but gentle, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so small but so intimate, it made my throat tight. When we finished, I took her bowl, my hand brushing hers again, and this time she didn't pull away, her fingers lingering against mine for a heartbeat too long. I turned to the sink, my heart hammering, scrubbing the bowls harder than I needed to, trying to drown out the thoughts racing through my head. She was older, out of my league, probably just grateful for a warm place to wait out the storm. But that touch, that moment, it felt like more, and I hated how much I wanted it to be. "There's a cot in the back room," I said, my voice rough, not turning around. "You can take it. I'll sleep out here." I heard her stand, the blanket rustling, and when I finally looked, she was in the doorway to the hall, her silhouette framed by the firelight. "You don't have to give up your bed," she said, her voice steady but soft, like she was testing me. I shook my head, too quick, too eager. "No, it's fine, you're the guest. Marcus would have my head if I let you sleep on that couch." It was a lie, Marcus wouldn't care. But I needed her to take the cot, needed some distance before I said something I couldn't take back. She studied me, her eyes piercing, like she could see the mess of thoughts in my head. She said, but there was a hesitation, a crack in her voice that made my chest ache. She turned, then stopped, looking back over her shoulder. "Elias," she said, my name sounding different in her voice, softer, heavier, like it carried a weight I didn't understand. "Thank you for everything." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and she disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I lay on the couch, the fire dying to embers, the storm still raging outside. Sleep wouldn't come, not with her just a room away, not with the way her voice echoed in my head, the way her touch lingered on my skin. I kept replaying that moment at the sink, the brush of her hand, the way her eyes had held mine. It was nothing, I told myself. She was just being polite, grateful, stuck here with me. But my mind wouldn't let it go, circling back to the way she'd said my name, the way she'd looked at me, like she saw something I didn't. The floorboards creaked, and I sat up, my heart pounding. Her silhouette appeared in the doorway, the blanket wrapped around her, her hair loose, falling over her shoulders like a dark curtain. "Can't sleep," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The storm's too loud." I nodded, gesturing to the chair by the fire, my mouth dry. She sat, pulling her knees up, the blanket pooling around her, and the firelight caught her face, highlighting that scar above her eyebrow, the weight in her eyes, the softness that hadn't been there before. "You ever feel like you're stuck?" she asked, staring into the flames, her voice so quiet it was almost lost. "Like no matter what you do, you can't move forward?" I swallowed, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Like you're running, but you're not going anywhere." She looked at me then, her eyes locking onto mine, and the pull was back, stronger, undeniable, like a tide I couldn't fight. "Exactly," she said, and her voice was so soft, so raw it felt like a confession. We sat there, the fire crackling, the storm screaming, and I knew something was shifting, something I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the blanket, her eyes searching mine, and I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding like it wanted to break free. What she says next will change everything. One word, one look, and there's no going back for either of us. The fire had dwindled to a faint glow, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat in the dimness of the cabin. The storm outside was a relentless beast, its screams weaving through the pines, rattling the windows of this old lodge on Juniper Ridge, northern Maine. I'm Elias Torrance, 22, caught in a moment I hadn't planned for, my pulse racing as I sat across from Nora Hadley. She was curled in the chair by the fire, her knees tucked under the frayed blanket, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, catching the last flickers of light. She was older than me, late 30s or 40, her face a map of sharp angles and quiet strength, with eyes that held a pain so deep it seemed to anchor her to the earth. Her question about being stuck, about running without moving, lingered in the air, and my clumsy answer had cracked something open, leaving a silence that felt alive, heavy with everything we weren't saying. Her fingers twisted the blanket's edge, a restless motion that betrayed the calm she wore like a shield. I sat on the couch, my hands gripping my knees, trying to steady myself against the pull of her presence. The firelight carved shadows across her face, highlighting the faint scar above her eyebrow, a jagged line that made me wonder what battles she'd fought, what losses she'd carried. I wanted to ask, to know her, but my throat was tight, my thoughts a tangle of nerves and something else, something dangerous, something that made my chest ache with a longing I didn't understand. "You don't say much," she said, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the storm's roar like a blade. A faint smile touched her lips, not mocking but curious, like she was trying to unravel me. I shifted, my boots scraping the floorboards, my face warming under her gaze. "Never been good at it," I said, my voice rough, betraying the nerves I was trying to hide. Words come out wrong, or not at all. It was too honest, and I braced for her to brush it off, to retreat into the distance she'd kept between us. Instead, she leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "I don't believe that," she said, her voice low, almost fierce. "You're saying plenty, Elias, just not with words." Her words hit me like a gust of wind, sharp and unexpected, and I felt exposed, like she could see straight through my clumsy silence to the mess underneath. I looked away, focusing on the embers, the way they glowed and faded, trying to anchor myself in something solid, something safe. The wind slammed against the cabin, a draft slipping through the cracks, making the flames flicker. I stood, needing to move, to break the weight of her gaze. "Need more wood," I muttered, crossing to the pile by the hearth. I tossed a log onto the fire, sparks flaring up, and felt her watching me, her eyes like a physical touch on my back. I turned, catching her gaze, and for a moment neither of us moved. Her eyes were deep, endless, like they held a story she wasn't ready to tell, and I felt something shift inside me, something raw and reckless that I didn't know how to name. "You're not what I expected," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. I froze, the log still in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. "What did you expect?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked, giving me away. She tilted her head, her smile fading, replaced by something softer, sadder. "Someone less real," she said, and the word hung there, heavy, like it carried more than she meant to give. I set the log down, my hands shaking slightly, and sat back on the couch, closer to her than before, though I hadn't meant to. The air between us was charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. "You're real too," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "More than most people I've met." Her eyes widened, just for a second, and I saw a crack in her armor, a flicker of vulnerability that made my chest ache. She looked away, her fingers tightening on the blanket, and I wondered what she was fighting, what kept her so guarded. The fire crackled, a spark flaring and dying, and she stood, the blanket slipping to the floor with a soft rustle. She crossed the small space between us, stopping just in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her, smell the faint lavender on her skin, mixed with the damp wool of her sweater. My breath caught, my hands still on my knees, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever this was. "You don't have to know what to do," she said, her voice steady but soft, like she was offering me a lifeline. "Sometimes it's enough to just be here." I looked up at her, my heart hammering, and saw the scar again, that jagged line above her eyebrow and the ring on her left hand glinting faintly in the firelight. She was married, or had been, and I was just a kid, a nobody, stuck in a cabin with a woman who was too much for me to understand. But her eyes held mine, and I saw pain there, yes, but also something else, hunger, longing, a need so raw it mirrored my own. "Nora," I said, my voice breaking on her name, and it felt like a confession, like saying it made her real, made this moment real. "Don't," she said, but it wasn't sharp, wasn't a rejection. It was soft, almost pleading, and her hand hovered near my shoulder, trembling in the air. I wanted to reach for her, to close that gap, but the ring, the years between us, the weight of everything unsaid held me back. This was wrong, impossible, but the pull was stronger than reason, stronger than fear. "I've been alone for a long time," she said, her voice breaking, and the words tore through me, unraveling something I'd kept buried. I stood too fast, and we were close now, too close, the space between us electric. "I shouldn't be here," I said, but I didn't move, didn't step back. Her hand touched my arm, light as a breath, and I felt it everywhere, a shock that ran through my bones. "You are here," she said, her voice steady now, like she'd made a choice. "And I'm glad you are." Her words were a spark, igniting something I couldn't control, and I saw the ring again, a cold reminder of everything that made this forbidden. "Nora," I said again, a question, a plea, a warning. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine, her breath warm against my skin, and I felt my resolve crumble, piece by piece. "Stay," she whispered, so soft I almost missed it, "or we'll freeze." It wasn't about the cold, not really, and we both knew it. Her words were a surrender, a truth laid bare, and I closed my eyes, my hands finding her waist, hesitant, like she might vanish if I held too tight. She didn't pull away, she stayed, her breath mingling with mine, her hands on my arms, and for the first time I felt anchored, like I wasn't running anymore. We didn't kiss, not then. We stood there, foreheads touching, her fingers tightening on my arms, mine resting on her waist, the storm raging outside like it wanted to tear the world apart. The ring pressed against my skin, a sharp reminder of the lines we were crossing, but her warmth, her closeness, drowned it out. The fire died completely, leaving us in near darkness, the only light from the embers' faint glow. She pulled back, just enough to look at me, her eyes searching mine, raw and unguarded. "I'm not supposed to feel this," she said, her voice breaking. "Not with you." "Not now." I reached up, my hand brushing her cheek, my thumb tracing the scar above her eyebrow, feeling the roughness of it under my skin. She closed her eyes, leaning into my touch, and I felt something shift, something final. "I don't know what this is," I said, my voice hoarse, raw with everything I couldn't say, "but I don't want to let it go." Her eyes opened, and there was no guard left, just her, open and vulnerable, and it scared me as much as it pulled me in. "Then don't," she said, simple and certain, and it broke me open. We didn't speak after that. She took my hand, her fingers threading through mine, warm and steady, and led me to the couch. We sat close, her head resting against my shoulder, the blanket draped over us both, a fragile shield against the world. The storm kept howling, but it felt distant now, like it couldn't touch us. Her hand stayed in mine, her thumb brushing my knuckles, a small gesture that felt bigger than words. I didn't know what would happen when the storm broke, when the world came back. I didn't know if she'd tell me about the ring, about her life, about what she was running from. All I knew was this moment, her warmth against me, the quiet certainty that something had changed, something I'd carry forever. Morning would come, the storm would die, and she'd be gone, her car freed from the ditch, a note left on the table, "Thank you, Elias." But that was tomorrow. For now we stayed, wrapped in each other, in the dark, in the warmth, in the impossible truth of that night. I felt her breath slow, her body relax against mine, and I knew, even if it was just for tonight, we'd found something real, something neither of us could outrun.